Yep. Okay. So we'll be talking about Gladiators, Commodus, the Severi, and the third century anarchy, and a number of other things tonight. Thank you all so much for coming out here. So I'm Timothy Doran. I'm professor of ancient history and big history at Cal State University, Los Angeles. As Kent said, I got my PhD from Berkeley in 2011, and I did Greek, Roman, and Phoenician history. And I'm delighted to see that the Phoenicians are back in style at this point in time. That's wonderful. So I teach a two semester long Greek history sequence and a 2 semester long Roman history sequence. I also occasionally teach ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East. And then I teach something completely wild called big history, where we start with the Big Bang and we end with the heat death of the universe. So to train myself on that, I had to relearn a lot of astronomy and biology, which was absolutely fun. Right. So my first book is called Spartan Oliganthropia. There's a word that trips off the tongue lovingly. That's about the Spartan population crisis. And I now have 2 contracts, one to do a new history textbook, a university level textbook of Sparta, and another to do a book on Spartan eugenics. So that's sort of, I'm pretty dialed into Sparta, but I've always been ambidextrous in both Greek and Roman history. And I told my instructors that I wanted to be that back when I was a graduate student at Harvard. So the first Gladiator film from 2000 took place in the last years of the reign of Marcus Aurelius. He was emperor from 161 to 180. Now, Hollywood was not doing a whole lot of this kind of sword and sandal type of epic. It hadn't really done those in a few decades. But Russell Crowe was very good in L.A. Confidential. How many of you have seen that movie? So that was in 97. That's still one of my favorite movies. My wife and I have watched that a few times in the past 2 years, I think. And The Gladiator ended up being a very big success. Coincidentally, I was then an undergraduate at Berkeley. That very semester, I was taking Roman Empire with John Bodel, who was visiting Berkeley from Brown University. And so I remember when he was telling us, oh, this weekend I'm about to go see Gladiator in the theater. I don't know what to think about it. So that was on a Thursday. And so we were all wondering how he was going to talk about it when we came back to class on Tuesday. Are you hearing me or am I dropping out? It's okay? Okay. So we were all really quite, curious. Some of us went out and saw it so that we would know what it was about. And some of us were sort of trepidatious because you know how this kind of movie can be sometimes. They're horrible. Look at the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. What a stinking pile of awful. But Professor John Bodel absolutely loved it. He said, well, some of it wasn't exactly accurate, but they really got the spirit of the Roman Empire really well. He thought it was just a great movie. Now, I think what's nice about this is that this broke the sort of trend of financial backers not wanting to invest in these sorts of sword and sandal epics, because then you had more. You had Troy. Some people got something good out of Troy, which is great. You had the best TV show of all time, which was called HBO Rome. Has any of you ever heard of this? Okay, this is the best TV show. To me, this is better than The Sopranos or Breaking Bad or anything. I thought it was absolutely amazing. There was something called Empire that was kind of short-lived on TV. It was around the same time as HBO Rome, and it was pretty good. You had this 300 and its sequel, which was, I didn't like either of those very much, but I will admit that they were kind of fun, and I'm kind of glad that they got made. And there were also more that I have not seen. So with Gladiator, you saw the seal broken. Now people were willing to put money into this kind of movie. They weren't afraid that it would become a flaw or something. And so 24 years later, there is a sequel, which I have not seen yet. And so I'm not a film scholar. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the history of the period. Hopefully this will be interesting for tonight and useful in the future for those of you who will choose to go and see this. Before we start, I like to just give an overview of the broad contours of ancient Roman history. The first period is called the monarchy, dating from 753 BC, which is the supposed date or the foundation of the city of Rome. That goes to 509 BC. And then in 509, there was the last king of Rome kicked out, and they started a republic, which would have two consuls at the top, only in power for 1 year, so people couldn't get too sick of them, and then a Senate that were making the decisions, and that lasted for about 500 years, from 509 to 27 BC. In 27 BC, an individual named Octavian, who was the grand-nephew of the dynast Julius Caesar, who had died in 44 BC, he was named as Augustus, which was a new title, and what this meant is that Rome now became an empire in the sense that there was an emperor at the top of the entire pyramid out. We can call Rome an empire before this with a lowercase e because it had a big, set of imperial territories. But in 27 BC, it had an emperor. So that's why we refer to the following period from 27 BC until 476 AD in the West as the Roman Empire. There is now an individual who is more powerful than the Senate, more powerful than the two consuls, and that's the imperial period. So let's start, before we talk about the precise chronology, let's talk about gladiators. And this is a way to sort of enter into the topic. In terms of the origin and the precursors of the gladiatorial games in the Roman state, these essentially spring from public contests, performances, and games that were collectively called ludi, L-U-D-I. Originally, these were religious in nature. They had grand public spectacles paid for by Roman governmental officials. The Senate would decide each year. So this is during the Republic. That's that middle period right there, when the Senate was, was the power in the Roman state. The Senate would decide how much money to allot to the year's upcoming ludi, and then an official called an aedile, there were several aediles, would plan them and sometimes add their own private months to make these as exciting as possible. Instead of aediles, the praetors, which is a very high-ranking official, took over the planning of these in the imperial period. And what you're going to see is an arms race, so to speak, as to how exciting and wild these kinds of spectacles could become. Very, very, very exciting and elaborate. This was a smart way to court future voters, is to have the most exciting possible games of this sort. Entry was free. These were held in wooden amphitheaters. We only see a permanent stone theater in 55 BC, quite late in the Republic period. But these did become more and more elaborate during this period. Julius Caesar famously almost bankrupted himself in 65 BC when he was aedile. This was a good gamble. It turned out to be smart in retrospect because just a few years later, he was elected consul. So that was smart on his side. Now, often these kinds of games were held as thanks for a military victory. They often had chariot races, wild animal hunts, theater events. Typically, there would be slaves and freedmen and foreigners as performers. The Romans had a very different idea about athletics and performance and plays than the Greeks did. Recall that in classical Greece, the Athenians, regular Athenian citizens, were happy to compete in any kind of athletic event. It was considered aristocratic. They were happy to act in the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides. This was really not the case in Roman culture. It was considered frivolous for a Roman citizen to perform in any kind of athletic event or to perform as an act. They didn't mind watching them, but they didn't want to perform it. They thought that was below the dignity of a Roman citizen. Under the Republic, you don't see gladiatorial events as part of these public spectacles. They would be held as privately sponsored events, and they were thought, the gladiatorial games specifically, were thought to have originated from Etruria. So this is the land that is north of Latium. Latium is where Rome is. That's where we get words like Latin. So in Etruria, the Etruscans did have funerary games that involved gladiatorial events, and so this is probably how the Romans got the idea for this. When the Ludi move into the imperial period, we see emperors start to gradually take over the financing and the planning of the. You've all heard of the Emperor Nero, of course. He paid for Ludi. They had gladiators, but according to our ancient source that describes this, there were no deaths at that particular game. There were also races and a mock sea battle. Imagine the difficulty, the engineering and hydraulic difficulty of creating a lake. To have a mock sea battle there, that was something that really impressed a lot of people. During these games, Nero, and this was typical of other emperors, throwing these kinds of games, would also distribute gifts to the people. This would ingratiate him to the people, and every once in a while when this kind of thing happened, the people would express their dissatisfaction for something that an emperor had done. So the Flavian dynasty built the Colosseum, which you see on the top left. This was finished in the year 80 AD, or if you don't use AD, then CE. Typically, there would be hunts and gladiatorial contests in this structure, and typically you'd have trained fighters, almost always slaves, becoming slowly the standard for gladiatorial combat. In the imperial period, we'll see more of this. A lot of these people would be trained in gladiatorial schools. They learned a lot of different weapons, how to fight with different weapons. And in terms of the origins of these people, some had been captured in war. This is the standard way for slaves to get captured, is through raids and war. And we know about this all the way back with Sumerian civilization from 3000 BC. Sometimes the gladiators, the persons chosen as gladiators, would be slaves whose masters want to punish them. And sometimes these would be criminals, and they would be thrown against either wild animals or against armed gladiators. So this was a form of execution. And I don't think this one is too strange for us, because you might argue that that's, in a way, more humane than lethal injection, because of course the criminal line of bravery and excitement. You could argue that. I'm not saying how I would argue. Someone could argue something like that. So this is the sort of thing that we would see in terms of the growth. Wealthy slave owners would rent their slaves out for these contests, and the idea that the loser was always killed is not actually accurate. That would not be cost effective at all. Sometimes the loser would just undergo a certain amount of humiliation, and then he would continue to fight on other days. So public and imperial funds would be increasingly used over the imperial period for these, and we have a few references in our ancient sources. In the year 80 AD, there were 100 days of spectacles and 9,000 annals were 9,000 annals. So this is from a pretty reliable source. We have some sub-literary evidence attesting to gladiators. What I mean by sub-literary is these are primary sources. They're from the period, but they're sort of, graffiti and little things like that. Here's an inscription at Rome. To the shades, so the shades would be the departed spirits of Marcus Ulpius Felix, a veteran Myrmidon who lived 45 years. By nationality, a Tungrian, so this is a Belgian. His wife, the freedwoman Ulpia Suntufe, and their son Justus erected this inscription to her beloved and well-deserving. So he's a Myrmidon, said he was back the gladiator. There's also a graffito at Pompeii. Pompeii has yielded all sorts of interesting evidence. Pompeii is how we know, one of the ways that we know how far literacy did in fact penetrate outside of the elite. And this says, heartthrob of the girls, Calidus, Thracian-style fighter, fought 3 times, won. There's a nice little rooster-like boast. You'll notice that the names are not Roman names. So in the first case, we do have a Marcus Ulpius Felix here. This is probably an adopted name. And then he's a Tungrian, so he's not a Roman. His wife is named Ulpia Suntuke. So Suntuke is a Greek, something like with love or with fortune. And then we have this person who's a Thracian-style fighter. So his name is Calidus. I'm not really sure what nationality that is. One of the curious things about the gladiatorial culture is the oath that they took. And their oath was like this: to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. So this was that oath. This was what they promised that they would be willing to. And there's something kind of creepy and harsh about a system in which that is the oath that you are expected to make. This is an interesting book by Carlin Barton, The Sorrows of the Ancient Romans, from 1993. Barton argues that there's a kind of sadomasochistic bond between the gladiators and their owners that is expressed in that. And that's an interesting perspective worth looking at, whether you ended up buying it or not. Okay, so now that we've talked about gladiators, actually, before we start talking about the period, are there any questions that are burning in people's minds that I can try and I do not guarantee it's being as sorry, let's move on. So let's talk about the period. On the death of Marcus Aurelius, Cassius Dio wrote, "Our history now plunges from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." So this is the period that we're beginning with. What we call the Roman 3rd century begins in the year 180 and ends in the year 285. So it's not exactly a century, and of course, as is usually the case, things don't correspond exactly to the rounded years. So 180 is the start point. Why? Because here is where Marcus Aurelius dies of the Antonine plague, which was probably smallpox. 285 is the end point because after a 50-year period of chaos, a new emperor will come in, and this is Diocletian, and this will be a separate era. So we can take this 3rd century and we can divide it into 2 halves. The first half is from 180 to 235. This is Commodus and the Severan dynasty, and we'll explain all of this, don't worry. The second half is 235 to 284. This is known as the crisis or the anarchy of the 3rd century. In that second half, in the crisis or anarchy section, we have over 50 persons claiming to be emperor. We have another plague. We have incursions by foreigners into Roman territory, and the empire very, 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 very close to collapse. It is in that period that the empire probably should have collapsed, except for the intervention of Diocletian. Our sources for the 3rd century, a significant source is what we call in the business, in the trade, the SHA. So this is the Scriptores Historiae Augustae. This is a curious source. These are anonymous biographies of emperors and sort of pretenders to the throne from 117 to 284. So this is not at the reliability level of someone like Tacitus or even Suetonius. This is vulgar, it is unreliable, and sometimes it is extremely funny. So we just call this the SHA. So I don't have to say Scriptores Historia Augustae every single time I mention this. It pretends to be written by 6 men in the period of Diocletian and Constantine. Nobody knows when it was truly written. Nobody knows how much fiction has been inserted into it. Many scholars see it as a kind of game, a kind of puzzle, possibly not simply unreliable, inaccurate, or mistaken, but fraudulent on purpose, but we're not exactly sure. Edward Gibbon, who wrote his famous work on the decline of the Roman Empire, thought that it was accurate, interestingly enough. So we're going to start with the narrative history of the first half. So this is the emperors. Here we have Commodus. On the right is a very beautiful bust of him when he was quite young, as you can see. And on the left is Joaquin Phoenix, playing in the movie Gladiator. Now, he would have had a beard when he was older, and this was a trend of the dynasty that he belonged to. Beards came back in style. They were thought to make people look more philosophical. Okay, so he would have had a beard a little bit later. Now, the big question is this. The dynasty that Marcus Aurelius and Commodus belonged to was a dynasty in which instead of your son succeeding you, you would choose a successor based on the person's virtue and skill and suitability and temperament. This is how it worked. This is how it had worked since the 90s BC. So when Marcus Aurelius chose his own son to his co-emperor and then his successor, we sort of wonder about this. It worked really well to not nominate your son. Why would you buck that, sensible trend? The precedent with the adopted emperors had produced an entire dynasty. That was the Antonine dynasty, a very universally admired, very effective emperors. You had people like Trajan, Hadrian. Probably the answer as to why Marcus Aurelius did this is because the Romans liked the idea of what we may call the dynastic principle. They viewed this rather positively. And so if you were an emperor with a son, maybe have so much of a choice. The only thing Marcus Aurelius could have done in the face of the people demanding that Commodus succeed him would have been an execution of Commodus, and not too many people desperately want to kill their sons or are eager to do so. I see some of you killed it. Well, sorry about that. So on November 27th of the year 176, Marcus Aurelius had made Commodus his co-ruler. But Marcus's method of rule placed a huge burden on the emperor. Marcus Aurelius wrote a work called the Meditations. How many of you know of this work? Okay, so this is actually survived. It's in like that Harvard shelf of classics, I think. It's kind of dark blue was. And we learn from reading this that Marcus thanked the gods for many things, that his children were not efficient in mind and body, that his wife was affectionate and straightforward and obedient, that his adoptive brother was a good person. Other people felt different. They thought that Marcus's brother was a lightweight. They thought that his wife Faustina was a slut. They thought that his son Commodus was an idiot. The rumor was that Marcus's wife Faustina encouraged the revolt of a certain Avidius Cassius in 175 because she thought that Marcus was about to die. It would actually take 5 more years, die of plague, and she didn't want their son Commodus to become an emperor. That's what Faustina probably thought of Commodus. So what was wrong with Commodus? I've just noted a moment ago that the way that Marcus Aurelius had, portioned out the duties of rule meant that the emperor had to be a certain kind of person, not just anyone. So this is from Cassius Dio, book 73. He lived in the second half of the 2nd century and the early 3rd century AD. He was a Bidenian in front of his eye. Cassius Dio writes, "This man, Commodus, was not naturally wicked, but on the contrary as guileless as any man that ever lived. His great simplicity, however, together with his cowardice, made him the slave of his companions, and it was through them that he at first, out of ignorance, missed the better life, and then was led on into lustful and cruel habits, which soon became second nature. And this, I think, Marcus clearly perceived beforehand. Commodus was 19 when his father died, leaving him many guardians, among whom were numbered the best men of the Senate, but their suggestions and counsels Commodus And after making a truce with the barbarians, he rushed, for he hated all exertion and a very comfortable life of the city. So what happened? A German group called the Marcomanni asked for peace. Commodus made peace with them with some restrictions. This isn't a bad thing to do, but the people actually liked Marcus Aurelius's policy of expansionism, and the military liked that too, so that's not going to make Commodus very popular. Cassius Dio continues, Commodus was guilty of many unseemly deeds and killed a great many people. Many plots were formed by various people against Commodus, and he killed a great many, both men and women, some openly and some by means of poison, secretly, making away, in fact, with practically all those who had attained eminence during his father's reign at his own. Here's where, if you remember the first Gladiator movie, you might want to think about Maximus being killed by Commodus. He became popular. That was one of the aims of it. Russell Crowe's character, Max. Now, we also see another phenomenon, which is the rise of the cubiculari. Here's a wonderful word for you. What is a cubicularius? This is a palace chamber. So a man named Saoteras, he was a Bithynian Greek, a freedman, which means a slave. He was Commodus's cubicularius. Very prominent. It's annoyed the senators. Commodus, as is the case with all bad emperors, did not understand that the emperor needed to respect the Senate very, very, very carefully. And so the SHA writes that in the year 180, when it came back to Rome, he celebrated a triumph with Saoteras, his debaucher, placed behind him in the chariot. In the course of the triumphal procession, Commodus several times turned his head and kissed him quite openly. So we're not really sure what to make of that and whether to trust it. But we'll talk in a moment about the problem of who to trust and whom to distrust and how we have to deal with that according to the rules. We know also about plots against Commodus. In the SHA, it says that Commodus's way of life caused his own sister to conspire with other elites to kill him. There was an assassination attempt. It was foiled, and the conspirators were put to death. The SHA also states that Commodus renamed the city of Rome Commodiana. And he adopted a Hercules type of appearance, which is borne out by the statuary. He accepted sacrifices as though he were a divine being. He practiced the rites of the Egyptian goddess Isis, and that's not too strange, really. And he ordered the votaries of the goddess Bellona to cut off their arms. This one sounds very unlikely. Now, I've already told you about the fact that Romans thought it was below their dignity to perform in an amphitheater. That would be like a president of the United States being the spokesman in professional wrestling. But Commodus actually did do this sort of thing, performing in an amphitheater. And there are very strange stories about him sort of ordering people who had certain impairments to do strange performances in the amphitheaters as well. We have similar reports from Cassius Dio. He also states that Commodus ordered that Rome itself should be called Commodiana, the legions called the Commodian legions. And on the day on which these measures were voted, the day known as the Commodiana Day, Cassius Dio continues that Commodus had assumed several titles at different times, such as Amazonius and Ex Superatorius, applied constantly to himself. Ex Superatorius would mean Joseph, something like beyond super, right? Above super, something like that, right? To indicate in every respect that he surpassed absolutely all mankind superlatively. So superlatively mad had the event Resh become. And to the Senate, he would send messages couched in these terms. The emperors Caesar, Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Pius, Felix, Sarmaticus, Germanicus, Maximus, Britannicus, pacifier of the whole earth, invincible, the Roman Hercules, Pontifex Maximus, holder of the tribunician authority for the 18th time. imperator for the 8th time, consul for the 7th time, father of his country, pater patria. 2 consuls, praetors, tribunes, and the fortunate Commodian Senate, greeting. That was his mode of speaking to them or addressing them. We have many statues erected representing himself in that Herculean garb with the lion's skin over his head as a cowl, and it was voted that his age should be named the Golden Age, and that this should be recorded in all the records without exception. So this is straight from C.S. During his reign, there were border wars with Mauritanians, Caledonians, Danes, a mutiny of troops in Britain. He had to do what they asked him to do. This was the only way to stop it. A financial crisis arising from his extravagance and his lack of care for the treasury, and the reappearance of informers and judicial murders and confiscations of property. December 31st, 192, he intended to assume the consulate to become a consul for the next day, that is January 1st, wearing a gladiator costume. Again, this was considered below the dignity of a Roman, much less an emperor. He was strangled by his wrestling companions, including one charmingly named Narcissus, who was bribed by the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Laetus and the chamberlain Saoterus, whom I mentioned a moment ago, and Commodus's own mistress. He then underwent the damnatio memoria. Anybody know this term? The damnatio. So this is the condemnation of the commemoration of someone. So typically this involves the name getting scratched out on monuments, sometimes the face chipped off of statues. That's called the damnatio memoria. And the SHA says that there were great acclamations by the Senate after Commodus's death. In fact, so that the Senate's verdict on Commodus may be known, I have included the acclamations verbatim from Marius Maximus and the content of the decree of the Senate. From the enemy of the fatherland, let the marks of honor be dragged away. Let the parricide's honors be dragged away. Let the parricide be dragged along. Let the enemy of the fatherland, the parricide, the gladiator be mangled in the charnel house. The executioner of the Senate is the enemy of the gods. The gladiator to the charnel house, he that killed the Senate, let him be put in the charnel house, etc., etc., etc. So this is quite different from the way that he addressed the Senate, and say quite different indeed. Now, there's an interesting lesson when it comes to understanding the history and the historiography of Commodus. There is not a single literary source from the period that is positive, that is not negative. Not that it's relevant, but even the film Gladiator portrays him quite negative. But back to the original, the primary sources, everyone portrays him very, very negative. And also, we don't have any evidence that contradicts this hostile tradition. So that means that as historians, we don't really have a choice but to basically accept this. And we say that there were some layers of frosting, layers of exaggeration, but the ethos of the historian means that we have to say, since I do not have evidence that he was actually a good person, I'm kind of obligated to accept that at least the kernel of his story is true. That's what we have to do as historians, whether we like it or not. It is not an option to say, well, I just feel in my heart that this couldn't be true. That's not a legitimate way to do history. You see historians doing this sometimes, and I always shake my head when I hear that. I say, oh, you have a hunch in 2024 that it wasn't really like this? What's your reasoning here? So after Commodus, we have a set of events resembling the horrors that happened in the years 68 to 69 after Nero died. We have the Praetorian Guard appointing a princeps, but frontier armies threaten civil war, and of course, this is the constant threat of the Roman Empire. The armies might start to get annoyed with the Senate, and they might decide to strike off on their own. In 193, we have the brief reigns of Pertinax and Didius Iulianus. Note the amusingly similar portraits of the respective coins of these two individuals. So first, Pertinax. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these two. Helvius Pertinax, a protege of Commodus's sister Lucilla's second husband. He had been an urban prefect, proconsul of Africa, so governor of the province of Africa, a restorer of peace among the revolting legions in Britain. And so upon Commodus's death, or murder, I should say, Pertinax bribed the Praetorian guardsmen. The Senate then confirmed his accession to emperor. He did give Commodus a decent burial, counter to the Senate's wishes that, as you noted in the beautiful explosion of hostility above, contrary to the wishes of the Senate, that the body of Commodus be mutilated. He did alienate the senators and the Praetorian Guard, and poor Helvius Pertinax was killed after 87 days of rule. We can see this, if you want, as a sign of how unruly things were at this time. Marcus Didius Iulianus, the guardsmen then auctioned the throne, literally auctioned it. And a wealthy elderly man, Marcus Didius Iulianus, then offered a much larger bribe than Pertinax had done to each of the Praetorian guardsmen. The thing is, the people of Rome wanted the governor of Syria, Pescennius Niger, to be emperor. And the emperorship was simultaneously claimed by Clodius Albinus in Britain and a certain Septimius Severus, whose army was on the Danube River. When Severus's army came close to Rome, Marcus Didius Iulianus, was deserted on all sides and then murdered in the palace. Again, if you want to take this as a sign of the instability of this period, you're probably right to do so. So now we have Septimius Severus. Interesting figure. This is a portrait of him and his wife, and the older of their two sons. Born in 146 AD at a place called Lepcis Magna. We'll talk about Lepcis Magna in just a moment. Reigning from 193 to 211. The SHA writes, his face inspired reverence, his voice was resonant, but with a trace of an African accent right up to his old age. So we see the Roman Empire being rather multicultural here. He was highly educated. His wife was named Julia Daub. She was a Syrian, so he was an African, and she was from Syria. So this again points to a widening of possibility in terms of ethnicity in the Roman Empire of this period. So what Septimius Severus did is he took Pertinax's name to retain continuity. This is something that I would have done myself. He disbanded the Italian Praetorian Guard and replaced them with 15,000 picked men. Mostly these were Thracians and Illyrians. Again, this furthers the theme that we're talking about a very multicultural sort of command structure here. His first challenge was the rivals for emperorship. He killed Pescennius Niger, whom I mentioned just a moment ago, the governor of Syria, and then he defeated the pretender Albinus. There were civil wars for a few years, and many equestrians and the 29 senators died for opposing Severus, but this was not too far outside the lines. Under Septimius, the military developed the ability to legitimize things. Albinus was cast as a public enemy. Septimius was now adopted into the family of the Antonines, officially speaking, posthumously adopted. The dead former emperor Commodus, who was his supposed adopted brother, posthumously adopted brother, was now officially deified. And those of you who know a bit about Roman imperial practices will know that it's sometimes, very often actually, an emperor will be deified. He will be declared a god typically after his death. And so Septimius' son Caracalla was legitimized as the junior partner as Caesar. And so speaking of the divinization of these people, let's pause and talk about this for a moment. Septimius's new pedigree as an official, on paper at least, Antonine, legitimizes him and his sons. Omens that supported this notion were publicized. Coins, inscriptions, and the imperial court cults would support Septimius's claims to divine approval. Military camps began to give worship to Septimius and his family as the Domus Divina, the divine cult, the divine family. Domus can mean family or us. And so Severus unofficially becomes a dominus. This is the name that slaves would call their master in Roman history, okay? And the term started to have more and more religious overtones of divinity for the person. He is the dominator. His son Gita was depicted as the god Sol Invictus. Anyone know Sol Invictus? So good. So you want to know who Sol Invictus? Right. Other than just a Roman sun god, I guess. Yeah, right. So the Romans and the Greeks had a lot of sun gods. Remember that sometimes in the Greek world you had always kind of a sun god, but Helios was the real sun god. But there tends to be a connection with the sun, and we see this in many, many, many different societies. When you have a high ruler, the high ruler wants to think of himself as the highest thing, so he could be an eagle, or he could be something even higher than an eagle, such as the sun. We see this with ancient Egypt. We see this with the Hittites. We see this with the Incas. This is a common sort of human goal for the sun. So Sol Invictus means the unconquered sun. It also happens to be the name of the death rock banner that I quite like. But the unconquered sun, and this was one of the solar deities. He was the sun that is unconquered because the sun has sort of troublesome days around December, and then after it's not the equinox, it's the solstice, then the sun starts to shine for longer. So the idea is the sun is unconquered. It cannot be conquered. So his son Gita started to be depicted as Sol Invictus. There's a Sol Invictus image right there. And his wife, Julia Domna, started to be depicted as Juno and other very, very high-ranking goddesses. So what we're looking at is a trend in which the Roman emperor became more of what we could talk about as a classic sort of divine monarch figure. Along with this, emperors would become more absolutist. Keep in mind that Augustus was always very careful to respect the prerogatives of the Senate. He called himself Princeps, which just meant the first person of the Senate. He was very, very careful. But then you have people like Caligula and Nero that weren't so good at that. At this point in time, we start to see, I guess you could say, an assimilation of the role of the Roman emperor to a kind of classic, very old civilizational divine figure. This becomes much less of a civilian-style magistracy, and it begins to adopt the terminology of a divine right monarch. I am the emperor because the gods have put me in this place. I partake of the gods. I am holy, that sort of thing. Everything associated with the office of the emperor becomes called sacred. They start using this term for everything. And I think a really good analogy would be the older divine kingships that we see in the Near East. And obviously the pharaohs would be another extremely, relevant sort of comparison. This would accelerate with Diocletian in 285. And we can say reasonably well that by the 4th century, the patterns that we will see in the Middle Ages, social, cultural, and political, will be born. Okay, so I talked about Leptis or Leptis Magna. So here we're looking at the north coast of Africa. There is Benghazi, there's Tunisia. So Septimius was Phoenician in origin on his father's side and Roman on his mother's side. Again, this is the town that they were from. This is a reconstruction of the harbor area of Leptis Magna. It was settled by native Libyans before the Phoenicians arrived. Leptis comes from the language of these native Libyan tribes. It became a Phoenician colony from either Tyre or Sidon. So the Phoenicians, of course, are where Lebanon is right now. And then it became Carthaginian around the 6th century BC. Here's the Arch of Septimius Severus at Leptis Magna. And there are some amazing things to see here. It would be nice for a straight or reinvigorate. Here is a coin from Leptis Magna with writing on it that is sort of Canaanite or Phoenician or Carthaginian. We look at it in any of those ways. And here's the god Eshmun on a coin from Leptis Magna. He was the hilly god of the Phoenician city of Sidon. And the way that Romans Greeks tended to think about foreign gods was they would assimilate them to their own gods. So, of course, they would think of him as Asclepius, who was, of course, the doctor son of Apollo, who also had edible powers. The staff is sort of reminiscent of a caduceus here. These are Phoenician-style heads at the Museum of Leptis Magna. So in terms of themes of this era, one of them, and so we're talking about really the era starting with the Severus, with Septimius Severus, but some of these are visible a little bit earlier. Rome becomes more important, and Rome becomes less important, and the provinces become more important. Most of the emperors of the 3rd century are not from Italy. They are not ethnically Italian. They are from the provinces. Many come from the Danube area. The Danube area was a place where there was almost a natural selection of that. Take out soft people. This was a brutal area to live. Defense was crucial. As mentioned, Septimius Severus even had a tunic that is a Phoenician accent, and that was what I mentioned in his slides ago. Further, his replacement of the Praetorian Guards, as we mentioned, were Illyrian in Thracian, not Italian. It is possible that he did not trust Italians. People in the provinces seem to have felt less allegiance to the leadership of the city of Rome. We can think of this as an increase in regionalism, thus an increase in its unity of the empire. The inhabitants of one region would typically, support a general from their own region, and some provinces would declare their own enemies and break away, or at least try to. So in addition to Rome being less important and the provinces rising, we have the military becoming more important in this period and the Senate becoming less important. The military now, especially with Severus, had the ability to proclaim someone as emperor, to declare someone as deified, to proclaim someone the official enemy of the state. And these were prerogatives previously held only by a Senate. Septimius Severus's advice to his sons, according to Cassius Dio, was live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. Again, this fits into the general trend, military and Senate down. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others. Here is a coin of Septimius Severus. It says Pius Aug, so the pious sword of Augustus. Here's a Gita with a star on the back. Presumably this is meant to be solid and vigorous. Now, in terms of internal policies for this dynasty, the ethnic Italians now become a minority in the Senate. You can look at this in different ways. You could see this as a kind of ethnic cleansing. You can see it as a kind of affirmative action for non-Italian. There are different ways to see this. There are new members in the Roman Senate, especially from Africa and from the eastern provinces. In terms of administrative appointments, we find persons with military experience from the equestrian order. So this is a wealthy order, but it's below the senatorial order. These equestrian-level persons tend to be preferred over persons from the senatorial order in this period. The powers of the Praetorian prefect also start to enlarge. He manages the grain supply, an absolutely crucial role for anyone. He is commander-in-chief of all armed forces stationed in the peninsula of Italy. He is the vice president of a strengthened imperial councils, and like a president cabinet. From 197 to 205, the Praetorian prefect would be Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, kinsman of Septimius, also from Leptis Magna, regarded by our sources as a cruel autocrat. and his daughter would be married to Caracalla. So alongside this, we see that there's an equalization of resources. The privileges that Italy and especially Rome had held start to decrease. The provinces now become as important as Rome in trust spending. There's an equalization of ethnic and cultural elements of the Roman Empire. We still find overly ambitious provincial governors still a threat. This is referred to in political science as the reciprocal agent problem. And one of my graduate students wrote a paper on this and used it to get into Stanford for his PhD. Rather impressive. Septimius, in response to the principal agent, starts to carve the provinces smaller and smaller so that he can deal with the one or we see military reforms. A coin series commemorates individual legions one by one. This is very exciting to numismatists. Anyone at White Gladiators? I think it's rare. Legionnaires pay risings for to 500 denarii per year. There are bonuses in gold and in kind. Legal recognition is now given to the marriages of soldiers. This had been a bone of contention for centuries. Garrisons and troops were given land to farm and facilities for commercial prizes rather than being expected to just be on guard at all times. And this creates a new military aristocracy for the empire. It provides a new administrative elite and a new layer from which to select future emperors rather than from the sort of moribund senatorial clubs, which had previously been the thing that provided civil emperors. The last acts of Septimius Severus, 208-211, an expedition to Britain with Julia Domna, Caracalla, and Ita, reconstruction of Hadrian's Wall. He died of pneumonia in York in 211 at age 64. I'm getting that pneumonia. I've had walking pneumonia, but so Caracalla and Gita. So in the upcoming Gladiator movie, these were played by Joseph Quinn. I don't know about just Quinn and Fred Heckiger. I've never even heard of Fred Heckiger before. Are any of you fans of these? Does anyone actually heard of these? Okay, neither of us. So I'm glad that I don't have to feel like I'm out of the loop there. So here are actual coins of Caracalla and Gisa, and here are just Heckiger. So Caracalla, he was nicknamed after the long Gallic cloak that he made fashionable at Rome. In 195, Septimius made him Caesar. Changed his name to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. He became Augustus in 198. In 208, he accompanied the family to Britain, succeeded with Gita as joint emperors. However, he and his brother Gita hated each other. Gita was assassinated in the year 211 by centurions at the orders of his brother Caracalla. The Praetorian guardsmen were upset. Diocasius writes that Caracalla mollified them. Rejoice, fellow soldiers, Caracalla is represented as saying, for now I am in a position to I am one of you, and it is because of you alone that I care to live, in order that I may confer upon you many favors. For all the treasuries are yours, I pray to live with you if possible, but if not, at any rate, die with you. For I am not afraid of death in any form, and it is my desire to end my days warfare. There should a man die, or nowhere. After this speech, he gave the Praetorians huge bribes and enlarged their ration allowance by 50%. Miraculously, they were thus able to soften their great sorrow over Gita's death. So what were the military policies of this period? The legionaries' pay was increased again. In 213, the German tribe known as the Alemanni gave their name to the French word for German, Allemand, are threatening a band of territory, the Agri des Mates, between the Upper Rhine and the Upper Danube. Caracalla defeated them, but he began a new policy, which was subsidies for the barbarians, especially Germanic barbarians. Why? Because this is cheaper than fighting. It's actually less expensive to just give them bribes. It kept away the German peril for a couple of days. In 212, this is a very interesting sort of event that occurs in legal history. This is the Edict of Caracalla, known as the Constitutio Antonina. Almost all the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were given Roman citizenship. Now, previously, Roman citizenship had been reserved for Italians and for elite provincials. These were the people that were thought to deserve it. So this new edict removed distinctions between municipia, coloniae, and other forms of citizenship. So these are two types of settlement that are of lesser legal rights than an actual city with full Roman citizenship. So everyone got it. And at this point, keep in mind, the empire had about 60 million people in it. This is a huge, huge empire in terms of world history. The only people who did not receive citizenship would be slaves, obviously, and a category of military hostage. Everyone else received it. Why do this? There are a lot of things to think about. One is that the edict brought in more money. Now everyone had to pay taxes that Roman citizens only had previously paid. Inheritance dues and the slave emancipation tax. The distinction in the military between legionaries who were Roman citizens and legionaries who were not, that is, who were auxiliaries, was now removed. So we could see this as a move toward egalitarian uniformity. That sounds good to us. This is a very egalitarian age that we live in. But the problem is now citizenship can no longer be dangled as a carrot, as an incentive to attract non-citizens, talented non-citizens into the Roman army. If you restrict something, it has more value. If you let it out free, it has less value, sadly. So at this point, we can say that the active distinction in the Roman Empire is no longer the dichotomy between citizens and non-citizens. It is between the honestiores and the familiores. The first group, the honestiores, also called the potentiores, this is now the upper stratum. Often these are people of military background. They would develop huge private estates, and it's probably fair to say that they are the forerunners of the barons of medieval lands that are, self-contained villas, becoming village. The lower stratum is now the familiores. This is basically the poor and the underclass. They will suffer harsher penalties for crimes. And they're still citizens, but in a way they're starting to become more like a subject than a citizen. For this to happen, citizenship itself would need to decline radically in value. These increasingly will put themselves under the protection of the local powerful people, potentiores or the honestiores, and this is especially true out in the countrysides, away from the cities. So these will be the forerunners of medieval serfs working on the estates of these more powerful people. Now, we can see this as a kind of cultural trend against Romanitas. Romanitas is the Latin word for what we would call Romanness, Romas. Italian and Roman customs were no longer favored in the end. For example, we have Caracalla's failures to Germans, his wearing a Gallic cape, is giving citizenship to almost every human being in the entire empire. Ethnic Romanness becomes visibly seen less as deserving of preservation legally or culturally. There are different ways to analyze this. We can take a multicultural analysis and say this is a beautiful triumph of cosmopolitanism. We can take a more pessimistic analysis and say that this is a kind of cultural nest. The sense of order is gone. We could look at this as a kind of population war. The Romans allowed themselves to be eclipsed. I would say probably the best analysis in my opinion, that requires the least steps would be a kind of demographic happenstance. Simply, this is the result of different populations breed more quickly and hence being able to assert themselves more coming into power. Now, since the most important distinction at this point is the honestiores versus the humiliores anyway, maybe some of this doesn't matter as much. The distinction is not Italians versus non-Italians. It's not Romans versus inhabitants of the empire who lack Roman citizenship. This is still a shift, and it requires a fair amount of thought. Okay, now Caracalla would be stabbed to death by a Praetorian prefect, Marcus Opellius Macrinus, in the year 217. Macrinus becomes the new emperor. He is Mauritanian by birth, so basically Morocco. He was from the Equestrian order, and he made the Senate proclaim Caracalla a god. He continued war against the Parthians. This was a war started by Caracalla. There were two major defeats. He surrendered his prisoners and paid the Parthians a large indemnity. This was regarded as obviously very good. There would be plots against Macrinus. After Caracalla's assassination, Septimius Severus's Syrian wife, Julia Domina, committed suicide. Her sister Julia Maesa, the wife of the consul Julius Avitus, desired to overthrow Macrinus. Her daughter, Julia Soaemius, was married to a fellow Syrian named Varius Marcellus. Their son was a 14-year-old, Varius Avitus Bassianus, this individual in the bottom right of the slide. This son would be better known as Elagabalus. How many of you have heard of Elagabalus? Okay, a few. Born in 204, reigning from 280 to 222, holding a prestigious hereditary priesthood, a sun god from Syria. This is Elagabal from Edessa in Syria. He was very handsome. This apparently was essential to him being selected as and allowed to be a priest. Julia Maesa claimed that this man was Caracalla's biological son, a real inheritor of the Severan dynasty. So legions in Syria immediately saluted him. Under the royal name of Caracalla, Macrinus fled, was hunted down and killed, and Elagabalus arrived at Rome in 290. He brought with him something quite interesting, a meteorite. It was aniconic, that is, it didn't look on Earth. But as you can see in the image, it was rather phallic look. You can see that it's put into a temple there. This represented the Syrian sun god of Nessa, Ila al-Jabal. Again, this is another form of Elagabalus, meaning the god of mounts. The first element of the name Ila is the same as Ada or El, or one of those kinds of names. So this was Latinized to Elagabalus, Hellenized to Heliogabalus, since this was a solar deity, and the Helios is, of course, the name for the sun in Greek, so it was too tactical to not do that. Now, we've already talked about solar worship and how it was rising in popularity with Sol Invictus, etc. So this could reasonably fit into that pre-existing trend, but Elagabalus ranked this god, this imported god, above Jupiter. Caused a nice temple to be built on the Palatine Hill called the Elagalia. He gave to Elgabal as wife the goddess Minerva. What's Minerva's name in Greek? Athena. What's the characteristic of a Minerva / Athena that would make us not think she want to be someone's wife? She's a virgin. So she is a virgin warrior goddess of crafts and war. And now Elagabalus declared that she would be the wife of the god Elgabal. So this was an attempt to make Elgabal the highest god, a new high god in the Roman pantheon above the god of Jupiter. He even had himself circumcised as an adult to consecrate his priesthood. And he compelled his male friends to undergo the rite of circumcision as an adult. Herodian says that Elagabalus danced around altars dedicated to Elagabal while Syrian women played on cymbals and drums. Roman senators and equestrians were forced to stand and watch. Midsummer each year, Elagabal assumed central parts in Rome's now greatest annual festival, and there were rumors of sacrifice of human victims, best-looking boys and girls in Italy. Here is a Roman coin struck in 218 to 222. There's starlight sun in front of him. It looks like an asterisk. This is another coin, Sacto Deo Soli Elagabal. So the deified sacred son Elagabalus. Note the black phallic stone standing in the quadriga, the four-horse chariot we're in here. His sexual tastes caused some dismay. Literary sources call him a massive homosexual. Cassius Dio says that he used to stand nude at the door of his room in the palace as harlots do and shake the curtains which hung from gold rings, while in a soft and melting voice he solicited passers-by. Herodian says that he had rude cheeks. His mother, Julia Soemius, provided him with 4 wives, one after another. He is described in sources as cruel and treacherous, and his sexual behavior as well as his religious activities worried his grandmother, Julia Maesa. So Maesa turned to her daughter, Julia Avis Maya, who had a 13-year-old son, Alexianus. They persuaded Elagabalus to appoint Alexianus as Caesar, as his junior partner, under the name Severus Alexander. They then paid the praetorians to kill Elagabalus and his mother in a latrine of all places, drag their corpses through streets and into the Tiber, and the black stone was returned to Emesa after a Roman interlude. So now we have the individual known as Severus Alexander, formerly Hessianus, reigning from 222 to 235, born in Caesarea Sublivano, a Phoenician city in 208, also a priest of the sun god Emesa, 14 years old. His mother ran the empire throughout his reign. She strengthened the Senate. She set up a council of 16 prominent senators to form a regency. This was regarded as an honest, efficient administration with the reduction of taxes and infrastructure improvements, roads, baths, libraries, aqueducts, subsidies for teachers, lending of money to the poor to buy farms, provision of primary school education, all. Some would argue that only they would think to do these kinds of fairly obvious improvements. But there were problems during this joint reign. One, they could not control the armies. The Praetorian Guard, Muci in 228, murdered its prefect. We have Muci's Mesopotamia. Perhaps Roman commanders refused to take orders from an email. And also the Sassanid dynasty over in Parthia, overwhelmed the Arsacid region. So we have a vigorous dynasty, Ardashir I, overwhelming Mesopotamia, threatening Syria and Cappadocia. Severus Alexander went east. There was a well-planned attack, but there were huge casualties on both sides. And the Alemanni and other Germans broke Roman defenses, attacked Gaul and Rhaetia. Severus Alexander and Amaya went north to deal with this, and they were killed by Pannonian legions. This was in 235, and this would result half a century of civil war, the famous 50-year anarchy. So we call this the crisis of the 3rd century. We won't go into anything like the detail that we just discussed. Essentially, a blow-by-blow narrative will not really be necessary, nor is there time, or I suspect willingness to go through this. Each army put forth its own candidate or an emperor. Most of were soldier emperor. There were 26 Augusti recognized in Rome. Only one of these escaped violent death. One emperor alone, Gallienus, suppressed 18 pretenders to the throne. This essentially was the end of the Pax Romana, of the Roman peace, which is arguably the greatest achievement of the Roman Empire. There would be a monetary collapse. collapse of energetism. This simply means philanthropic donations by wealthy people. Regions breaking away. Illyria would become prominent. The Germans would pressure the frontiers. Probably the revolts were caused by ambitions of the officer class and an undisciplined soldiery. And we see this kind of thing much, much, much earlier. The disorder now became chronic. It permeates all branches of the military, not just the Praetorian Guard. There was a general loss of loyalty to the empire. Probably some of this has to do with what we call the provincialization of the leash. Instead of being loyal to the government, to the Senate, to the empire, to Rome as a super personal idea, we have people that are in armies that are loyal to specific commanders. And typically these will be from very, very backwoods areas. Again, the fact that in the Constitutio Antoniana, citizenship could no longer be held as a reward meant that as an incentive was no longer usable to attract a better kind of recruit. If you're in our army for 20 years, you can become a citizen. That was the deal beforehand. This may have led to the enlistment of subjects who were less fully Romanized. Some called the barbarism of the army, certainly an unintended consequence of the bestowal of citizenship to everyone. We find hideous problems of the era with Germans, Franks, with Palmyra, with Iranian dynasties, monetary collapse, and all of the aforementioned contenders to the throne. A complete collapse of the silver monasteries occurs during this period. The share of silver in Roman coins increases quite dramatically. The final emperor in this period is Varian, assassinated in 284. At this point, the army in the east declared the commander of the emperor's bodyguard, and named Diocles, as the new emperor. Diocles kills a guy named Opher in public, and one of the later emperors, not accepting Diocles' nomination, the two bring armies to Moesia, and that emperor's men insert their man and support this Diocles. Diocles would soon be renamed Diocletian, and he would herald the end of this 50-year anarchy and essentially a new period in Roman history, and that would be known as the Dominating. Thank you very much.